Shadows in the night. The hospital hallways were quiet at this hour, the only sounds coming from the soft hum of fluorescent lights and the occasional beeping of distant machines. Ruby's small figure blended into the shadows, her dark skin and braided hair making her nearly invisible against the dimly lit walls. She pressed her back against the cold surface, her heart thudding loudly in her chest as the heavy footsteps of the night security guard echoed down the corridor. She held her breath, counting the steps in her head. 3, 4, 5, she whispered softly, her lips barely moving. The guard turned the corner as she predicted, his boots squeaking on the polished floor as he moved further away. Ruby exhaled slowly, her chest still tight with anxiety. She clutched her worn backpack tightly, feeling the comforting weight of her few belongings inside. This wasn't her first night hiding here. She had studied the routines of the night staff over the past 2 weeks, learning the patterns of their shifts and the best times to move undetected. The pediatric ward was her destination, as always. She felt safest there, with its brightly colored walls and the quiet comfort of children's stories painted in murals. Ruby darted across the hallway, her sneakers making barely a sound. The thin soles had long since worn down, and she could feel every crack and crevice in the hospital's tiles beneath her feet. She hugged the walls, keeping her movements swift and precise. The elevators were a risk she avoided whenever she could, so she took the stairs instead, her small legs moving quickly but carefully as she ascended to the ward. The pediatric ward looked different at night. Without the hustle and bustle of doctors and nurses during the day, it seemed almost magical. The rainbow-painted walls glowed faintly under the low lights, and the cartoon characters on the ceiling tiles smiled down at her. She headed to her usual corner by the large window overlooking the city. The view from there always made her feel a little less alone, as if the twinkling lights of the buildings were tiny beacons of hope. She arranged 2 plastic chairs into her makeshift bed with practiced precision, stacking them in a way that wouldn't wobble. Her jacket, worn thin from countless washes, doubled as a blanket. It wasn't warm, but it was better than nothing. From her backpack, she pulled out a medical textbook she'd found discarded in the hospital library. The spine was cracked, and the pages were dog-eared, but it fascinated her. "I'm going to learn, Mom," she whispered, her voice a soft promise to the still figure lying in the ICU several floors away. Her mother, Grace, had been in a coma since the accident. Ruby didn't fully understand the medical jargon the doctors used, but she was determined to figure it out. Every word she read, every term she learned, felt like a step closer to saving her mom. Ruby traced the diagrams in the book with her finger, trying to memorize the parts of the brain and how they worked. She knew her mom's injury had something to do with her head, but the details were confusing. She glanced up at the window, the city lights blurring through her tired eyes. "Thompson women don't give up," she murmured, repeating her mother's favorite saying like a mantra. It had carried her through every tough moment, every late-night hunger pang, and every lonely walk home after school. Her mother's voice echoed in her mind, warm and comforting. "We stick together, no matter what." She leaned back against the chair, the medical book still clutched tightly to her chest. Her stomach growled softly, reminding her she hadn't eaten since the day before. She ignored it. There were bigger things to worry about. As her eyes grew heavier, she thought of their tiny apartment, now empty and cold without her mother. The silence there was unbearable, the shadows too dark. Here, in the hospital, she felt closer to Grace. Ruby's eyelids fluttered shut, the book slipping from her hands and landing softly on the chair beside her. The faint hum of the hospital became her lullaby, blending with the rhythmic beeping of the monitor somewhere down the hall. She dreamed of her mother's smile, her laughter filling the room as she made pancakes on a Sunday morning. It was a memory Ruby clung to, her anchor in a world that felt like it was falling apart. A watchful eye. Dr. Michael Carter was nearing the end of another long shift. His office was cluttered with patient charts and half-empty coffee cups, but he didn't mind the mess. Pediatrics was his calling, and he loved the work, even when it was exhausting. Tonight, though, something gnawed at the edge of his awareness. He'd first noticed the girl 3 nights ago, a small figure darting through the hallways like a shadow. At first, he thought she was a patient, perhaps sneaking out for a late-night snack or a stroll to escape the confines of her room. But the more he watched, the more he realized she wasn't supposed to be there. She's not on any of the patient rosters, Nurse Sarah had confirmed when he asked. Probably a visitor staying late. But Dr. Carter wasn't convinced. Visitors didn't move like that. Quick, quiet, and deliberate, as though they were trying not to be seen. Tonight, he spotted her again, slipping into the pediatric ward with her backpack slung over one shoulder. Her movements were practiced, almost routine. He followed her at a distance, pretending to review a chart as she set up her little camp by the window. She moved with the efficiency of someone who had done this many times before. 2 chairs stacked perfectly, a thin jacket spread over them, a book pulled from her bag. She settled in, oblivious to his watchful eyes. Dr. Carter's heart tightened as he observed her. She couldn't be more than 12 or 13, far too young to be navigating the world alone. The dark circles under her eyes and the way her clothes hung loose on her frame told a story he didn't yet know but was determined to uncover. Tomorrow, he decided, turning away and heading back to his office. Tomorrow, I'll talk to her. Ending on a cliffhanger. Ruby slept soundly in her corner, unaware of the concerned doctor who had noticed her nightly visits. As the city lights flickered outside the window, a storm was brewing, not just in the sky, but in the halls of the hospital. Lives were about to change, and secrets that had been hidden in the shadows would soon come to light. For Ruby and Dr. Carter, this was just the beginning of a journey that would test their courage and strength in ways neither of them could imagine. Unveiling shadows. Dr. Michael Carter arrived at the hospital earlier than usual the next evening. The strange girl, the one with the quiet movements and haunting eyes, had been on his mind all day. He couldn't shake the image of her small frame curled up on the makeshift bed of chairs in the pediatric ward. The sight had stirred something deep within him, a mixture of concern, curiosity, and guilt. How long had she been hiding in plain sight, unnoticed and unhelped? The pediatric wing was unusually quiet tonight, the hum of machines and the occasional soft footsteps of nurses filling the space. Dr. Carter walked slowly down the hallway, scanning each corner for the girl. His sharp eyes noticed everything. A crumpled piece of paper under a chair, a forgotten toy by a bed, and finally, the familiar worn backpack peeking out from behind the large potted ficus near the window. Ruby was there, as he expected, sitting cross-legged on her makeshift bed. She was engrossed in her medical book, her small fingers tracing the words on the page as her lips moved silently, practicing the complex terms. Her concentration was so intense that she didn't notice Dr. Carter's approach until he was just a few feet away. "Good evening," he said softly, his voice warm but steady. Ruby jumped, her book tumbling to the floor. Her wide eyes met his, filled with fear and the instinct to run. Her hands darted to her backpack, clutching it as if it were a lifeline. I'm sorry," she stammered, her voice trembling. "I was just waiting for my mom." Dr. Carter held up his hands in a calming gesture, taking a step back to give her space. "It's okay," he said gently. "You're not in trouble. I just wanted to talk." Ruby's eyes darted toward the exit, her body tense and ready to flee. "I don't want to bother anyone," she said quickly, her voice small but firm. "I'll leave if I'm not supposed to be here." Dr. Carter shook his head. "You don't need to leave," he assured her. He crouched down to her eye level, making himself less intimidating. "What's your name?" Ruby hesitated, her fingers tightening around the straps of her backpack. She studied his face, searching for any hint of malice or deception. Finally, she whispered, "Ruby." "That's a beautiful name," Dr. Carter said with a small smile. "Ruby, I've seen you here a few times now. Are you visiting someone?" She nodded quickly. "My mom," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "She's in the ICU." Dr. Carter's heart ached at the vulnerability in her voice. "How long has she been there?" he asked softly. Ruby hesitated, glancing down at her hands. "A few weeks," she admitted, "but she'll wake up soon." "I know she will." Dr. Carter nodded, his expression serious. "I'm sure the doctors and nurses are doing everything they can to help her," he said. "But Ruby, I have to ask, where do you go when you're not here? Do you have someone looking after you?" Ruby's shoulders slumped, and she looked away, her silence speaking louder than any words could. Dr. Carter waited patiently, giving her the time and space to answer. Finally, she whispered, "It's just me." The weight of her words hit him like a physical blow. A child, barely 12 years old, navigating the world alone while her mother lay unconscious in a hospital bed. It was unthinkable. Dr. Carter took a deep breath, fighting back the anger and frustration that rose within him. Not at Ruby, but at the circumstances that had forced her into this situation. "Ruby," he said gently, "you shouldn't have to go through this alone. There are people here who can help you. I can help you." Her eyes filled with tears, and she quickly wiped them away with the back of her hand. "I don't need help," she said stubbornly, her voice cracking. "I just need my mom." Dr. Carter's heart broke at her words, but he didn't push her. "I understand," he said softly. "But if you ever change your mind, I'm here." Ruby didn't respond, but the slight nod of her head told him she had heard him. A search for truth. After his conversation with Ruby, Dr. Carter couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to her story. He returned to his office, the fluorescent lights casting a harsh glow over his desk as he opened his computer. Logging into the hospital's database, he began searching for any information about Ruby's mother. It didn't take long to find her. Grace Thompson, 37 years old, hospital janitor. Admitted to the ICU 3 weeks ago after a workplace accident. The details of the incident were vague, but the medical notes confirmed that she had suffered a severe head injury after slipping on a wet floor in the hospital's storage area. Dr. Carter's jaw tightened as he read further. The maintenance logs attached to Grace's file revealed a troubling pattern. Multiple requests for repairs to the storage room floor had been submitted over the past few months, all noting the same issue: standing water from a leaking pipe. None of the requests had been addressed. This could have been prevented. Dr. Carter muttered under his breath, his anger simmering just below the surface. He leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. Grace's injury wasn't just an accident. It was the result of negligence. His thoughts turned to Ruby, alone and vulnerable while her mother lay in a coma. He couldn't ignore this. Someone had to take responsibility. Confrontation and determination. The next morning, Dr. Carter found himself in the hospital's HR office. The small, sterile room smelled faintly of disinfectant, and the woman behind the desk barely glanced up as he entered. "I need to see the maintenance records for the storage area where Grace Thompson was injured," he said firmly. The HR manager, a middle-aged woman with sharp features, frowned. "Those records are confidential," she replied curtly. "You're not authorized to access them." Dr. Carter's eyes narrowed. "A woman is in a coma because of a preventable hazard," he said, his voice low and controlled. "And her 12-year-old daughter is sleeping in the pediatric ward because she has nowhere else to go. If you think I'm going to stand by and do nothing, you're mistaken." The HR manager hesitated, her gaze flickering to the stack of papers on her desk. After a long pause, she sighed and reached for the maintenance logs. "I'll give you what I can," she said reluctantly. Dr. Carter took the documents and left without another word. Back in his office, he pored over the logs, highlighting every ignored maintenance request and documenting every instance of negligence. The evidence was damning. But as he compiled his findings, he knew that presenting them to the hospital board wouldn't be enough. He needed Ruby's story, the human side of this tragedy, to make them understand the gravity of the situation. Ruby's trust. That evening, Dr. Carter found Ruby in her usual spot. She looked up as he approached, her expression wary but less fearful than before. "Hi, Ruby," he said, sitting down beside her. "I found your mom's file today. I know about the accident." Ruby's eyes widened, and her hands tightened around her book. "You do," she whispered. Dr. Carter nodded. "I also know that it wasn't your mom's fault. The hospital didn't fix something they should have, and she got hurt because of it." Ruby's lip quivered, and she looked down at her lap. "I always knew she worked too hard," she said softly. "She was always tired, but she never complained. She just wanted to take care of me." "She sounds like an amazing woman," Dr. Carter said gently. "And I promise you, Ruby, I'm going to do everything I can to make sure she gets the help she needs. But I might need your help too." Ruby looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of hope and uncertainty. "What do you need me to do?" "Just tell your story," Dr. Carter said. "The board needs to understand what this has been like for you. They need to see the person behind the file." Ruby hesitated, then nodded. "Okay," she said quietly. "I'll do it." Dr. Carter smiled, his heart swelling with admiration for the brave little girl beside him. "We'll do it together," he said. "You're not alone in this, Ruby." A letter to the world. Ruby sat at a small desk in the corner of the family suite that Dr. Carter had helped arrange for her. The room, while small, felt like a sanctuary after weeks of hiding in hospital corridors. It had a bed with soft blue sheets, a desk beneath a window, and enough light to brighten even the darkest corners. But tonight, the weight of her task made the space feel smaller, heavier. A blank sheet of paper lay before her, its stark whiteness almost blinding. Ruby clutched her pencil tightly, her knuckles turning white. Dr. Carter sat across from her, his presence calm and reassuring as he waited for her to begin. "You don't have to rush," he said softly. "Just write from your heart." Ruby took a deep breath, her chest rising and falling as she steadied herself. She thought of her mother lying in the ICU, her face pale and peaceful beneath the tangle of wires and tubes. She thought of the nights she'd spent curled up in the pediatric ward, clutching her medical books like a lifeline. Finally, she pressed the pencil to the paper. "My name is Ruby Thompson," she wrote in careful, deliberate letters. "I'm 12 years old, and my mom, Grace Thompson, is everything to me." Her words flowed slowly at first, each sentence heavy with emotion. She wrote about her mom's laughter, how it used to fill their tiny apartment with warmth, even when money was tight. She wrote about the way her mom would sing while cleaning, her voice bright and cheerful, as if trying to banish the weight of their struggles. Ruby's pencil paused for a moment, and she blinked back tears before continuing. "Mom always worked so hard," she wrote. "She cleaned this hospital every night so that patients and doctors had a safe place to be. She never complained, even when she was tired or hurting. She said that's what being a Thompson woman was all about, staying strong, no matter what." Dr. Carter watched as Ruby's small hand moved across the page, her writing growing faster and more confident as she poured her heart out. She wrote about the accident, how her mom had slipped on the wet floor in the storage room, and how everything changed after that. Her voice, though silent, seemed to fill the room with every stroke of her pencil. "She's been in a coma for weeks," Ruby wrote, "and I'm scared. Scared that she'll never wake up. Scared that I'll lose her. But I won't give up. Mom always said we stick together, no matter what." Ruby paused, chewing on the end of her pencil, as she thought about what to say next. Dr. Carter leaned forward slightly, his kind eyes encouraging her to continue. "I spent nights here in the hospital, hiding because I didn't want to go home alone," she wrote. "I read books about medicine, trying to understand what was happening to her, and I wrote letters to her, even though she couldn't read them. I just wanted her to know that I was here, that I wasn't leaving her." Ruby's hand trembled as she reached the final part of her letter. Her voice cracked as she whispered the words she wrote. "I don't know what will happen next, but I'm asking for help. My mom needs surgery, and we can't afford it. Please, don't let her die because of something that wasn't her fault. She's more than just a patient in a file. She's my mom." A rally of support. The next morning, Ruby's letter, now carefully folded and placed in an envelope, found its way into the hands of the hospital board. Dr. Carter stood at the head of the boardroom table, his expression calm but firm, as he presented Ruby's heartful plea. "This isn't just about policy or budgets," he began, his voice carrying the weight of his conviction. "This is about a child who has already lost so much and is on the verge of losing everything. Grace Thompson was a dedicated employee, and her accident was preventable. We failed her, and now we have the chance to make it right." The board members listened in silence, their expressions a mix of discomfort and skepticism. Chairman Davidson leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled as he studied Dr. Carter. "We understand your concerns, Dr. Carter," Davidson said finally. "But the hospital has protocols in place for these situations. We can't simply bypass them every time someone makes an emotional appeal." "This isn't just an emotional appeal," Dr. Carter countered, his voice rising slightly. He held up the maintenance records, the ignored repair requests highlighted in bold yellow. "This is evidence of negligence. Grace Thompson's injury happened because this hospital failed to act. If we don't take responsibility for that, what kind of institution are we?" The room fell silent as his words hung in the air. Dr. Carter's heart pounded in his chest as he waited for a response. Finally, one of the younger board members, Dr. Patel, spoke up. "Perhaps we should hear more about Ruby's situation," she said, her voice thoughtful. "If this letter represents her experience, we owe it to her to take it seriously." The bulletin board. While the board deliberated, the hospital staff rallied around Ruby and her mother. Word of Ruby's story spread quickly, and soon nurses, doctors, and even janitors were coming forward with stories about Grace. They described her kindness, her work ethic, and the way she always went above and beyond to make the hospital a better place. Lisa, one of the pediatric ward nurses, took it upon herself to create a bulletin board in the main hallway. She pinned up Ruby's letter, surrounded by photos of Grace at work and messages of support from the staff. The board quickly became a focal point of the hospital, drawing the attention of patients, visitors, and staff alike. "We stand with Grace," one message read. Another said, "Justice for Ruby's mom." Ruby stood in front of the board one afternoon, her eyes wide as she took in the outpouring of support. Dr. Carter stood beside her, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. "Look at all these people," he said softly. "They're here for you and your mom." Ruby nodded, her throat too tight with emotion to speak. For the first time in weeks, she felt a glimmer of hope, real, tangible hope, a turning point. The next day, Ruby's letter made its way beyond the hospital walls. Dr. Carter, determined to amplify her voice, reached out to a local journalist he trusted. The story of the young girl fighting for her mother's life in the face of systemic failure quickly captured public attention. News outlets picked up the story, and social media buzzed with hashtags like #JusticeForGrace and #HelpRuby. Ruby was overwhelmed by the attention, but Dr. Carter was there to guide her through it. "You're stronger than you think," he told her one evening as they watched the news coverage together. "You've already inspired so many people." As donations began pouring in from strangers moved by Ruby's story, the hospital board found themselves under increasing pressure. Their initial reluctance to act gave way to a growing realization that they could no longer ignore the voices calling for change. A decision looms. Back in the boardroom, the atmosphere was tense as the members reconvened to vote on Grace's surgery. Dr. Carter stood outside the door, his heart pounding as he waited for the outcome. Ruby sat beside him, clutching her journal tightly to her chest. "No matter what happens," Dr. Carter said softly, "you've already made a difference. You've shown the world how brave you are." Ruby nodded, but her eyes were filled with worry. She thought of her mother lying in the ICU, and she whispered a silent prayer. "Please," she thought, "let them help her." The board's verdict. The boardroom was a battlefield of words and ethics. Tension hung thick in the air as the hospital administrators debated Grace Thompson's fate. Outside the room, Ruby sat on a wooden bench with Dr. Carter beside her. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered slightly, casting uneven shadows on the pale hospital walls. Ruby's small hands clutched her journal tightly to her chest, her knuckles white with the strain. She glanced up at Dr. Carter, searching his face for reassurance. "How long do you think it'll take?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Dr. Carter's expression was calm but serious. "It's hard to say, Ruby," he admitted, placing a steady hand on her shoulder. "But no matter what, we'll figure this out together." Inside the boardroom, Chairman Davidson cleared his throat, commanding the attention of the other members. "Let's get to the heart of the matter," he said, his tone brisk. "We've all read the letter. We've reviewed the maintenance logs and the evidence of negligence. But the question remains, how much are we willing to allocate from our already strained budget to cover Grace Thompson's surgery?" Dr. Patel, one of the youngest and most progressive members of the board, leaned forward. "This isn't just about the budget," she argued. "It's about our responsibility as a hospital. We failed Grace by ignoring those maintenance requests. We owe it to her and her daughter to make this right." Davidson frowned, his fingers tapping rhythmically against the table. "And what precedent does that set?" he countered. "If we bend the rules for one case, what's to stop others from expecting the same?" "It's not bending the rules," Patel shot back. "It's correcting an injustice. This hospital has a moral obligation to its employees, especially when they're harmed on the job." The debate raged on, with voices rising and falling in heated exchanges. Some board members sided with Patel, emphasizing the hospital's ethical duty. Others echoed Davidson's concerns about setting a precedent and the potential financial strain. A movement beyond the hospital. While the board deliberated, the hospital staff continued to rally around Ruby and her mother. The bulletin board in the main hallway had grown into a vibrant tapestry of support. Patients, visitors, and employees stopped to read Ruby's letter, their faces reflecting a mix of compassion and outrage. Sarah, one of the pediatric nurses, had taken it upon herself to organize a fundraiser. She set up a table near the hospital cafeteria, where staff and visitors could donate toward Grace's medical expenses. The large glass jar sat in the center, already half filled with cash and coins. Beside it was a sign that read, "Help save Grace Thompson. Every dollar counts." Ruby, accompanied by Dr. Carter, visited the table that afternoon. Her eyes widened at the sight of the donations pouring in. People she'd never met approached her with kind words and encouragement. "You're so brave, sweetie," one elderly woman said, slipping a $20 bill into the jar. "Your mother must be so proud of you." Ruby nodded, her throat too tight with emotion to respond. She glanced up at Dr. Carter, who gave her an encouraging smile. "This is what happens when people see the truth," he said gently. "They want to help." A small victory. Later that evening, Dr. Carter received a call from a local news station. The reporter, a young woman named Maria Hernandez, had heard about Ruby's story through social media and wanted to do a feature on her and Grace. "We think this could really bring attention to the issue," Maria explained. "It's not just about Grace's situation. It's about workplace safety and accountability." Dr. Carter hesitated. He knew the hospital board would not be thrilled about additional scrutiny, but he also knew how much was at stake. After a moment's thought, he agreed to the interview. The next day, Maria and her camera crew met Ruby in the family suite. At first, Ruby was nervous, her hands fidgeting in her lap as the camera rolled. But as Maria gently asked her questions about her mother and their life before the accident, Ruby began to relax. "She's my hero," Ruby said, her voice steady despite the tears welling in her eyes. "She worked so hard to give me a good life, even when things were tough. I just want her to wake up so I can tell her how much I love her." The interview aired that evening, and the response was overwhelming. Donations to the fundraiser tripled overnight, and #JusticeForGrace began trending on social media. Strangers from across the city, and even from other states, sent messages of support, offering prayers and financial contributions. For the first time since her mother's accident, Ruby felt a glimmer of hope, but the final decision still rested in the hands of the hospital board. The verdict. The board reconvened the next morning, their faces grim as they prepared to announce their decision. Dr. Carter and Ruby sat in the front row of the conference room, surrounded by a handful of supportive staff members. The air was thick with tension, and Ruby's heart pounded so loudly she could barely hear the chairman's opening remarks. After thorough discussion and review, Davidson began, his tone as measured as ever. The board has reached a decision regarding Grace Thompson's medical expenses. Ruby held her breath, her fingers gripping the edge of her chair. Dr. Carter placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, his expression calm but resolute. "We have decided," Davidson continued, "to approve the full cost of the surgery and cover all related medical expenses." The room erupted in applause and cheers. Ruby's eyes filled with tears as she turned to Dr. Carter, who gave her a wide smile. "See," he said softly, "I told you we'd figure this out. A race against time." The victory was bittersweet. While the hospital's commitment to covering the surgery was a major milestone, Grace's condition was still precarious. The neurosurgeon, Dr. Wilson, explained the risks to Ruby and Dr. Carter in a private meeting. "The pressure on her brain has increased," he said, pointing to the scans. "We need to operate as soon as possible." Ruby nodded, her small hands clenched into fists. "Do whatever you have to," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "Just save her." The surgery was scheduled for the next morning. As the hours ticked by, Ruby stayed by her mother's side, holding her hand and whispering softly to her. "Please, Mom," she said, her voice breaking. "You have to wake up. I need you." Dr. Carter stayed with her, offering quiet support. He watched as Ruby read aloud from one of her medical books, her voice steady even as tears streamed down her face. "You're going to be okay," Ruby said, her words a mix of hope and desperation. "We're Thompson women, remember. We don't give up. A community united." As the surgery approached, the hospital staff rallied together once more. Nurses prepared Grace for the operation with the utmost care, their faces reflecting the determination that had taken root throughout the hospital. The fundraiser had surpassed its initial goal, and the additional funds were used to set up a small trust for Ruby's future. In the waiting room, a group of nurses, janitors, and even patients gathered to support Ruby and Dr. Carter. They'd brought food, blankets, and words of encouragement, creating a makeshift family for the young girl who had touched all their hearts. "We're all rooting for her," Sarah said, placing a comforting hand on Ruby's shoulder. "Your mom is strong, Ruby. She's going to pull through." Ruby nodded, her eyes brimming with gratitude. For the first time in weeks, she didn't feel alone. The surgery. The morning of the surgery arrived with a nervous stillness that seemed to grip the entire hospital. Ruby sat in the waiting room, her small hands clutching her mother's favorite scarf. The worn fabric was soft under her fingertips, and its faint lavender scent reminded her of Grace's hugs, the way her arms would envelop Ruby when she'd had a bad day. But now Ruby had no comforting embrace to shield her. Her mother's fate lay in the hands of the surgeons preparing just a few floors away. Dr. Carter sat beside Ruby, his presence steady as ever. His coffee sat untouched on the small table in front of them, growing cold as he watched Ruby's anxious movements. She fiddled with the hem of her sweater, her foot tapping softly against the tile floor. "She's strong, Ruby," he said quietly, his voice breaking the silence. "Stronger than you know." Ruby nodded, but her eyes remained fixed on the small clock on the wall. Every tick of the second hand felt like an eternity. The surgery was set to last 6 hours, and every moment stretched unbearably long. Nurses and doctors bustled around the waiting room, their hushed voices and hurried steps a stark contrast to the stillness that enveloped Ruby and Dr. Carter. A few familiar faces stopped to offer words of encouragement: a nurse from the pediatric ward, a janitor who had worked with Grace, even a cafeteria worker who had seen Ruby sneaking meals late at night. "We're all rooting for her," one of them said, squeezing Ruby's shoulder gently. "Your mom's a fighter." The waiting room vigil. Hours passed. Ruby had barely moved, her eyes glued to the clock, as if willing time to move faster. Dr. Carter stayed by her side, occasionally stepping away to answer calls or check updates from the surgical team. Each time he returned, Ruby's hopeful gaze met his, searching for any sign of news. "Still stable," he reported after his third trip to the ICU desk. "Dr. Wilson says everything is going according to plan." Ruby exhaled softly, her shoulders relaxing just a fraction. But the tension never left her completely. She reached into her backpack and pulled out her journal, flipping to the pages where she had written letters to her mom. She began to read them aloud, her voice trembling but determined. "Dear Mom," she started, her words filling the quiet space around her. "Today I met Dr. Carter. He's been so nice to me, helping me stay close to you. You'd like him, I think. He's funny, and he never treats me like a little kid. He says I'm brave, but I don't feel brave. I just want you to wake up." Dr. Carter listened quietly, his heart heavy with the weight of Ruby's words. Each letter was a window into her world, a world of fear, hope, and love. He couldn't help but admire her resilience, even as it broke his heart to see how much she had endured. The surgery ends. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the door to the waiting room opened, and Dr. Wilson stepped inside. His scrubs were wrinkled, and his face bore the exhaustion of a long surgery, but his expression was calm and composed. Ruby shot to her feet, her journal tumbling to the floor as she clutched the scarf tighter. "Is she okay?" she asked, her voice trembling. Dr. Wilson smiled gently, nodding. "The surgery went well," he said. "We were able to relieve the pressure on her brain. Now we just have to monitor her closely and wait." Ruby's knees wobbled, and she nearly collapsed back into her chair. Dr. Carter caught her, his hand steadying her shoulder. "You hear that?" he said softly, a smile breaking across his face. She made it through. Tears streamed down Ruby's face as she whispered, "Thank you," over and over again. Her small voice was filled with equal parts relief and exhaustion. Dr. Carter knelt beside her, meeting her gaze. "She's got a long road ahead, Ruby," he said gently. "But this is a big step in the right direction. She's fighting, just like you. The long road to recovery." In the days following the surgery, Grace remained unconscious but stable. The ICU team monitored her closely, tracking every sign of progress. Ruby visited her mother every day, sitting by her bedside and reading aloud from her medical books and journals. "I learned something new today, Mom," Ruby said one afternoon, her voice soft but hopeful. "Did you know the brain can heal itself in ways we don't even fully understand? Dr. Wilson says your brain is amazing, just like you." Dr. Carter often joined Ruby during these visits, bringing her snacks or books to keep her occupied. He had taken on the role of her unofficial guardian, advocating for her at every turn. When the hospital administration hesitated to provide additional support for Ruby, Dr. Carter didn't back down. "She's been through enough," he told the board during one particularly tense meeting. "The least we can do is make sure she has what she needs." A glimmer of hope. One evening, as Ruby sat by Grace's bedside, something extraordinary happened. She was holding her mother's hand, her thumb tracing small circles on Grace's palm, when she felt the faintest twitch. Ruby froze, her breath catching in her throat. "Mom," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Grace's fingers moved again, ever so slightly. It was a small movement, but it felt monumental. Ruby's heart raced as she pressed the call button for the nurse. Within moments, a flurry of activity filled the room as the medical team rushed in. "She's showing signs of responsiveness," one of the nurses said, her voice filled with excitement. "That's a very good sign." Ruby's eyes filled with tears as she looked up at Dr. Carter, who had just arrived. "She's waking up," she said, her voice trembling with joy. "She's really waking up." Dr. Carter placed a hand on her shoulder, his own eyes glistening with emotion. "You were right, Ruby," he said softly. "Thompson women don't give up." The turning point. The news of Grace's progress spread quickly through the hospital, reigniting the staff's hope and determination. The bulletin board in the main hallway was updated with messages of celebration, and the fundraiser for Ruby and Grace continued to grow. Ruby spent every moment she could by her mother's side, talking to her, reading to her, and holding her hand. Each small sign of improvement, a twitch of the fingers, a slight movement of the eyelids, was celebrated as a victory. Dr. Carter continued to support Ruby in every way possible, but he also began to see a change in her. She was no longer the frightened, lonely girl he had first met in the pediatric ward. She was strong, resilient, and determined, a reflection of the mother she so dearly loved. Ending on a cliffhanger. One afternoon, as Ruby sat by Grace's bedside, her mother's eyes fluttered open for the first time. Ruby gasped, her heart pounding as she leaned closer. "Mom," she whispered, her voice filled with equal parts hope and fear. Grace's lips moved slightly, her voice barely audible. Ruby held her breath, waiting for the words she had been longing to hear. The dawn of healing. Ruby sat frozen beside her mother's bed, her wide eyes locked on Grace's fluttering eyelids. For weeks, she had imagined this moment, dreamed of seeing her mother awake again, hearing her voice, and feeling the warmth of her hand squeezing hers. But now that it was happening, she found herself overwhelmed with emotion, unable to speak or move. "Mom," she whispered, her voice trembling as she leaned closer. "Can you hear me?" Grace's lips parted, but no sound came out at first. Her face was pale and drawn, her features softened by weeks of unconsciousness, but there was a spark of awareness in her half-lidded gaze. Ruby's heart raced as she gently squeezed her mother's hand. Dr. Carter entered the room quietly, holding a clipboard. He froze when he saw Grace's open eyes. "Ruby," he said softly, his voice breaking through her trance. "It's happening. She's waking up." Grace's lips moved again, and this time, a faint sound escaped. Ruby leaned in closer, tears streaming down her cheeks as she strained to hear. "Ruby." Grace's voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper, but it was unmistakable. "Mom." Ruby cried, her voice breaking with relief. She clutched her mother's hand tightly, her tears falling onto the crisp white sheets. "I'm here. I've been here the whole time. I missed you so much." Dr. Carter stepped forward, his trained eye scanning Grace's vitals on the monitor. "Her responsiveness is excellent," he said, his tone both professional and filled with quiet joy. "She's stable, Ruby. This is a good sign." Grace's eyes flickered toward Ruby, her movements slow and deliberate. "You stayed?" she managed to whisper, her voice cracking with effort. Ruby nodded furiously, her braids bouncing. "Of course I did. I couldn't leave you, Mom. I promised we'd stick together, no matter what." Grace's lips curled into the faintest smile, and Ruby felt her heart swell with hope. For the first time in what felt like forever, she saw a glimmer of the vibrant woman who had been her entire world. The road to recovery. Grace's awakening marked the beginning of a long and arduous journey. While her responsiveness improved, the effects of the accident and weeks of inactivity had left her weak. Physical therapy became a crucial part of her recovery, and Ruby was there every step of the way. The first time Grace tried to sit up in bed, her arms trembled under the effort, and her face was etched with pain. "I can't," she murmured, her voice shaky. "It's too much." "You can," Ruby said firmly, her hands gripping the edge of the bed as if her own strength could support her mother. "Thompson women don't give up, remember." Grace chuckled weakly, the sound barely audible, but it was enough to make Ruby smile. With Dr. Carter and the physical therapist's help, Grace managed to sit up for a few minutes that day. It was a small victory, but to Ruby, it felt monumental. Justice for Grace. While Grace focused on her recovery, Dr. Carter continued his fight for justice. He had gathered enough evidence to build a strong case against the hospital's negligence, and with Ruby's permission, he reached out to a lawyer who specialized in workplace safety cases. The lawyer, a sharp and compassionate woman named Naomi Bennett, met with Dr. Carter and Ruby in the hospital's family suite. "This is a strong case," Naomi said, flipping through the stack of maintenance logs, incident reports, and testimony from Grace's coworkers. "The hospital failed to address a known safety hazard, and Grace paid the price. We can hold them accountable." Ruby listened intently, her small hands gripping the edge of her chair. "What will happen to the people who ignored the reports?" she asked, her voice tinged with both curiosity and anger. Naomi smiled gently. "That's for the court to decide," she said. "But with the evidence we have, I'm confident we can get justice for your mom." A community united. News of Grace's recovery and the lawsuit spread quickly, reigniting the wave of support that had first rallied behind Ruby's story. The bulletin board in the hospital's main hallway was now a mosaic of thank you notes, photos, and updates on Grace's progress. Patients, visitors, and staff stopped by daily to leave messages of encouragement. The fundraiser for Ruby and Grace had surpassed its original goal, with donations pouring in from across the country. The extra funds were used to cover Grace's therapy expenses and set up a college savings account for Ruby. Ruby, now a familiar face in the hospital, became a symbol of resilience and hope. She often stopped by the pediatric ward to visit the other patients, sharing her story and offering words of encouragement. "You never gave up, Ruby," one of the nurses told her one day. "And because of you, so many people have found hope." A mother's love. As Grace's strength returned, she and Ruby began to reclaim the life they had fought so hard to preserve. They returned to their small apartment, which had been cleaned and prepared for their arrival by volunteers from the hospital staff. It felt strange at first, familiar yet different, but Grace was determined to make it feel like home again. One evening, as they sat together on the couch, Grace reached for Ruby's journal, which sat on the coffee table. "You've been writing letters to me?" she asked, her voice filled with emotion. Ruby nodded, her cheeks flushing. "I wanted you to know what was happening, even if you couldn't hear me," she said softly. Grace opened the journal, her eyes scanning the pages. Tears filled her eyes as she read Ruby's heartfelt words, each one a testament to the love and determination that had carried them through the darkest days. "I don't deserve you," Grace whispered, pulling Ruby into a tight embrace. "You're my miracle, Ruby, my reason for everything." Ruby buried her face in her mother's shoulder, her tears soaking into the fabric of Grace's shirt. "You're my miracle too, Mom," she said, her voice muffled but steady. "I wouldn't have made it without you." A new beginning. Months later, Grace and Ruby stood outside the hospital, their faces glowing with gratitude and hope. Dr. Carter joined them, his hands in his pockets and a proud smile on his face. "Ready for the next chapter?" he asked. Grace nodded, her arm wrapped around Ruby's shoulders. "We're ready," she said, her voice strong and full of conviction. As they walked away from the hospital, the sun setting behind them, Ruby glanced up at her mother. "You know, I've been thinking," she said. "I want to be a doctor someday, like Dr. Carter." Grace smiled, her eyes brimming with pride. "You'd be amazing, Ruby," she said, "and I'll be with you every step of the way." For the first time in what felt like forever, the future felt bright. Together, they had faced unimaginable challenges, but their love and resilience had carried them through. And now, as they stepped into a new chapter of their lives, they knew that they could face anything together. A full circle of healing. Months passed, and Grace's progress became a testament to her resilience. Every small achievement, from taking her first steps in therapy to regaining her voice, felt like a monumental victory. The hospital staff, who had grown to love Ruby and Grace, celebrated each milestone with heartfelt joy. The bulletin board in the main hallway, once filled with messages of support, now showcased updates on Grace's recovery and photos of her smiling with Ruby. But the fight for justice was far from over. The courtroom battle. The day of the court hearing arrived, and the atmosphere was heavy with anticipation. Ruby sat in the gallery beside Dr. Carter, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Grace, still physically weak but mentally sharp, sat next to their lawyer, Naomi Bennett. Though her movements were slower and her voice softer, Grace's presence exuded strength. Naomi stood before the judge, presenting the case with precision and passion. "This hospital failed Grace Thompson," she began. "Despite multiple maintenance requests, they neglected to fix a dangerous hazard. As a result, Grace suffered a life-altering injury. This is a case of clear negligence, and it's time for accountability." The hospital's lawyers countered, attempting to shift blame and minimize their responsibility. But Naomi's evidence was airtight. Maintenance logs, testimonies from staff, and medical reports painted an undeniable picture of systemic failure. Ruby's heartfelt letter was also entered into evidence, moving everyone in the courtroom with its raw honesty. When Grace took the stand, her voice wavered, but her determination was unshakable. "I love my job," she said, her gaze steady. "I took pride in keeping the hospital clean and safe for everyone. But when I reported the hazard, nothing was done. And now my daughter and I are left picking up the pieces." Ruby's eyes filled with tears as she listened to her mother speak. She reached for Dr. Carter's hand, and he gave hers a reassuring squeeze. After hours of testimony and deliberation, the judge delivered the verdict. The hospital was found liable for negligence and ordered to pay a substantial settlement to Grace. More importantly, the judge mandated a complete overhaul of the hospital's maintenance policies to ensure such an incident would never happen again. The courtroom erupted in murmurs, and Ruby threw her arms around her mother. "We did it, Mom," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "We really did it. A new chapter." With the settlement, Grace and Ruby's lives changed in ways they had never imagined. They moved into a modest but cozy house in a quiet neighborhood, leaving behind the memories of their cramped apartment. Grace continued her therapy, growing stronger every day, while Ruby thrived in school. Her passion for medicine blossomed, and she joined her school's science club, eagerly soaking up every opportunity to learn. Dr. Carter remained a constant presence in their lives. He often visited their new home, bringing books for Ruby and sharing updates about the hospital. He had become more than a doctor, he was family. One evening, as they sat together on the back porch, Ruby looked up at the stars. "I still can't believe everything that's happened," she said softly. "It feels like a dream." Grace placed a hand on her daughter's shoulder, her grip firm and steady. "It's real, Ruby," she said. "And it's because you never gave up. You're the reason we're here." Ruby smiled, her heart swelling with pride. "I learned it from you, Mom," she said. "Thompson women stick together, right?" "Always," Grace replied, pulling her daughter into a hug. Giving back. The settlement not only secured Grace and Ruby's future, but also allowed them to give back to the community that had supported them. They donated a portion of the funds to the hospital's pediatric ward, ensuring that children like Ruby would always have a safe place to turn to in times of need. They also established a scholarship fund for hospital employees and their families, honoring Grace's years of dedication. Ruby, now a teenager, often spoke at local events, sharing her story to inspire others. She became a symbol of resilience and hope, her journey showing that even in the darkest times, love and determination could light the way. The final step. One day, as Ruby walked through the hospital with Dr. Carter, she stopped outside the IQ, the place where her life had changed forever. She glanced at the room where her mother had once lain unconscious, the beeping of monitors and the hum of machines etched in her memory. "It feels so different now," she said quietly. "Like it's not scary anymore." Dr. Carter smiled. "That's because you faced it head-on," he said. "You turned your fear into strength. Not many people can do that." Ruby nodded, her gaze steady. "I think I'm ready," she said, her voice filled with determination. "I'm ready to start helping people, just like you helped me." Dr. Carter placed a hand on her shoulder, his pride evident in his expression. "You're going to make an incredible doctor, Ruby," he said, "and I'll be here every step of the way." The legacy of hope. Years later, Ruby stood in a white coat, her stethoscope draped around her neck. She had fulfilled her dream, becoming a doctor dedicated to helping families like hers. Her first day on the job was at the very hospital where her journey had begun. As she walked through the familiar hallways, she paused in front of the bulletin board that had once been filled with messages of support for her and her mother. Now, the board displayed her story, a reminder of what hope, love, and determination could achieve. Ruby touched the edge of the board, her heart full of gratitude. "This is for you, Mom," she whispered, "for everything you taught me, for never giving up." In her heart, she knew her journey had come full circle. She had faced the darkest of nights and emerged into the light, stronger than ever. Together, she and Grace had rewritten their story, proving that even in the face of unimaginable hardship, love and resilience could conquer all.